I remember the moment I asked for a divorce like it was yesterday. It was one of those days when time seems to stand still, you know? I was there, in front of everyone, thinking I had everything under control. With an air of confidence, I dropped the words, "I want a divorce." In my head, I thought I knew exactly what would happen next. I imagined everyone's reactions would be predictable, and of course, that I'd walk out of that situation just the way I wanted. Funny how we can fool ourselves, right? I expected that after saying that, Helena would crumble, maybe scream or beg me to reconsider. But, to my surprise, she remained completely calm. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even seem shocked. And I, who had braced myself for a dramatic scene, was left speechless in the face of that unexpected reaction. Imagine preparing yourself for a storm and all you find is a sunny day. Her calmness shook me more than any outburst of anger could have. I always saw myself as being in control, like the conductor of an orchestra where everyone just followed my lead. But there, in that moment, I realized it wasn't quite like that. That request for divorce, which I thought would be my big moment, ended up becoming something very different from what I had planned. And the feeling of being in charge began to slip through my fingers. The worst part was the silence. Not only did Helena accept what I said calmly, but she didn't even try to convince me otherwise. That, for me, was a punch in the gut. Sometimes, it's not what is said that hurts, but what remains unsaid. And in that silence, she showed me a strength I had never noticed before. A strength that made me question everything I thought about her and about myself. And you know what happened next? I thought that, with time, everything would go back to normal, that Helena would eventually give in and things would follow the path I had planned. But the truth is, that was just the beginning. I had no idea how things were about to change. When Helena finally opened her mouth, what she said left me even more lost. With a serene voice, she simply said, "I know." "What do you mean, I know?" That phrase echoed in my head for a few seconds. I was ready to face arguments, accusations, anything but that disarming tranquility. In that moment, it seemed like she had been expecting it all along, that nothing I said could really shake her. And that bothered me more than I could admit. It was as if I had lost a battle I didn't even know was happening. What confused me the most was the lack of any strong emotional reaction. I expected tears, anger, anything that would make me feel like I still had some sort of power in that situation. But no, she simply accepted what I said, without creating any drama. That made me realize that maybe I never had the control I imagined. Maybe, all these years, she had been quietly holding onto this strength, while I lived under the illusion that I was in charge. At the same time, I began to realize that her silence, that simple response, was hurting me in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't the separation itself, but the fact that she seemed not to need me anymore. It was as if, in that moment, I had disappeared from her life in a way I wasn't ready to accept. The feeling of being out of control grew more and more inside me. She disarmed me without even raising her voice, and I didn't know what to do with that. For days, I tried to understand how she could act like that, with so much calm, while everything in my head felt like chaos. I tried to imagine what she was feeling, but every time I thought about it, I felt even more lost. It was as if she was living in a different reality than mine, a reality where I wasn't as important as I believed I was. And that hurt more than anything else. Her serenity was what threw me off the most. And so, I kept waiting for some slip-up, some moment where she would show weakness, ask me to come back, show me that there was still a chance to reverse everything. But that moment never came. Instead, I realized she had made a choice, and that maybe, for the first time in a long time, I was no longer part of that choice. It was when Helena spoke again that everything became even clearer to me. She looked me straight in the eyes, and with that same calmness that was driving me crazy, said she had one condition. From that moment on, I would never be a part of her life again. That hit me like a slap in the face. How could she say never again? I wasn't prepared to hear something so final. She wasn't just accepting the divorce, she was excluding me completely, as if I had never existed in her life. Those words left me completely at a loss. I had always imagined that, even after everything, I would still have some kind of presence in her life. Maybe as a friend, maybe as someone she could count on from time to time. But from the way she spoke, it became clear that there would be no maybe. It was definitive. I would never have a place in Helena's life again, and that made me realize how lost I really was. I didn't know how to deal with that cold feeling of being discarded so abruptly. I began to wonder if I had underestimated Helena all these years. Could it be that, deep down, she was always stronger than I believed? And if so, how did I never notice before? While I was so focused on controlling everything, could she have been preparing herself for this moment? Her calmness, her confidence, began to seem more and more frightening. I stood there, completely vulnerable, while she seemed invincible. What I couldn't understand was how she could make such a harsh decision and show no sign of regret. Did she feel nothing? Did she have no doubts? To me, that seemed impossible. I was full of doubts, fears, regrets, and she seemed to be moving on without looking back. Every word she said felt like a sentence, and I couldn't find any way out of the situation I had created myself. Deep down, I began to realize that the control I had always thought I had was an illusion. And now, suddenly, Helena was in charge. She set the rules, and I had no choice but to accept them. When I said those words, "I want a divorce," I had no idea what I was really starting. It was like pressing a self-destruct button without understanding that I was standing in the middle of the explosion. I thought I had control, but with each passing minute, it became clearer that I didn't. Those words I had thrown out so confidently were like a boomerang, coming back at me with a force I hadn't expected. I was ready to cut ties, to free myself and start a new life with Annapurna, but what I found was the beginning of something much bigger than I had anticipated. The funniest thing was realizing that, as I said those words, I no longer felt them the way I used to. It seemed that, in some way, Helena already knew this was going to happen, that she had been prepared for everything. While I believed I was dictating the course of our story, she had already turned the page. That's when I realized that the divorce wasn't the end for her, it was the beginning of something. For me, those words meant freedom, but for her, they were just the closing of a chapter that may have ended long ago. And it's funny how, after so much time together, you think you know the person you're married to. I thought I knew what Helena would do, how she would react, but I was wrong. Her silence was stronger than any scream. She accepted the divorce, but in some way, she was the one who truly left me. And that was the hardest thing to accept. I had said the words, but she was the one who had really ended everything. When she said, "I know," it was as if she had been years ahead of me, waiting for that moment. I began to understand that, deep down, I had never truly known how to handle Helena. I always believed she was predictable, that I had control over what happened between us. But there, I realized that the one who was deluded was me. Her calmness, her silent acceptance, showed me how strong she was, stronger than I could have ever imagined. And while I was saying those words with false confidence, she was letting me see just how wrong I was. In that moment, when the words came out of my mouth, I realized I was really losing something valuable. But it was already too late. Helena had made her choice, and suddenly, I found myself the only one who hadn't understood what it really meant. The way Helena stayed calm completely disarmed me. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. It seemed she was at peace with the decision, as if she had already gone through the emotional process long before I said those words. I was ready for a storm, but all I got was a gentle breeze. And in the middle of that, I felt lost, like I was drifting while she already knew exactly where she was going. Her calmness wasn't just a response to the situation, it was a declaration of who she was. I, who always saw myself as someone in control, was realizing that Helena had a quiet strength that I had never fully understood. While I tried to maintain a facade of power, she was showing a security that left me unsettled. She didn't need to scream, cry, or beg. Just by being calm and firm, she made it clear that she was fine without me. And that hit me like a blow. I kept thinking, how could she be so serene? Did I mean nothing to her? Or was she just hiding the pain? The truth is, the more I thought about it, the more I felt lost. And the more she showed her peace, the more I felt out of place. Her calmness was like a mirror, forcing me to look at the mess I was making of my own life. While I was struggling internally, Helena stayed strong, without looking back. That made me realize that I had never truly understood who she was. I always saw her as someone fragile, someone who needed me. But at that moment, it became clear that she was much stronger than I had ever imagined. And that quiet strength of hers, that ability to handle the situation without breaking down, showed me how much I had underestimated her all these years. Now, I was facing a new reality, where Helena was no longer the woman who needed me. She was someone who had already overcome everything I thought I controlled. And that was something I still didn't know how to deal with. When Helena said, "I know," it was as if she was telling me that all of this had been expected. As if, in some way, she had prepared for the end long before I realized it was coming. I expected my words to cause a reaction in her, to catch her by surprise. But that, I know, was more devastating than any desperate scream. It was a silent acceptance of something I still hadn't processed. That response completely disarmed me. How could she know? How could she be so calm in the face of something so serious? I began to realize that, while I thought I was in control of the situation, Helena had already resolved everything within herself. She knew the end was coming, and unlike me, who tried to control the course of the story, she had already accepted that there was nothing more to be done. And that acceptance of hers scared me. While I stood there, not knowing what to do with that simple response, Helena demonstrated a peace that left me uncomfortable. That phrase, "I know," summed up everything. It was as if she was telling me she had already gone through all the suffering, all the anguish, and now there was only moving forward. And I, who always considered myself the stronger one in the relationship, was now feeling small in the face of all that serenity. I think what bothered me the most was the idea that Helena no longer needed me. I was there trying to free myself, but deep down, it was her who was already free. I thought the decision was mine, but now I realized she had prepared for that moment long before me. Her "I know" said much more than I wanted to hear. It said that I was no longer part of her life in the way I had imagined. And in that instant, I understood that there was nothing more I could do to change that. Helena had already decided. And her life, with or without me, would move on. Helena's silence was something that gnawed at me inside. After that short phrase, "I know," she practically said nothing more. And that silence, which I expected to be temporary, started to drag on. Every day that passed, I felt the weight of that silence growing. I wanted to ask, I wanted to understand what she was thinking, but at the same time, I was afraid of the answer. It was as if each word left unsaid was another door she was closing between us, and I was left outside, not knowing how to get back in. The curious thing is that her silence didn't seem to stem from sadness or hurt, as I had initially thought. No, Helena's silence was different. It came from a place of peace, from someone who had already accepted what was coming. And that made me uncomfortable because I couldn't connect with her peace. I was restless, full of doubts and regrets, while she, with her silence, seemed to have found a strength I had never known. I tried a few times to provoke a reaction, to say something that would make her respond, but nothing worked. Not that she ignored me or was rude, not at all. It was simply an absence of conflict. Helena had no more interest in arguing, and that was even more unsettling than a fight. She was living in a new reality where I no longer had the power to affect her in any real way. And for someone like me, who always wanted to have control over situations, that was unbearable. Every time I saw her, she seemed more distant, but not in a physical way, more emotional. It was as if she was in a place I could no longer reach. And somehow, that made me realize I had been losing that connection long before the divorce. Only now was I truly seeing the distance between us, because Helena had finally stopped hiding it. Her silence was the most powerful way she could show me that the end had arrived, long before I realized. I began to understand that that silence, which bothered me so much, was the greatest show of strength she could give. Helena no longer needed to speak, nor argue. She had decided to move on, and her silence said everything I needed to know. But at the same time, it made clear that there was no turning back. One day, while I was trying to process everything, I ended up talking to Clara, Helena's best friend. Clara had always been very close to her, and I thought that maybe she could help me understand a little more about what was happening, maybe reveal something I still couldn't see. I sat down with her, trying to make sense of things, and asked, "How is she so calm? How can she act like this?" Clara looked at me with a mix of pity and understanding. She seemed to already know something that I was still trying to figure out. Clara explained to me that Helena had made her decision a long time ago. She told me that, even before I asked for the divorce, Helena had already been preparing her mind and heart for life without me. And that her calmness wasn't indifference but acceptance of what was inevitable. She suffered a lot, Rodrigo, Clara told me, in a tone that hinted she knew more than she was willing to share. But over time, she realized the best thing she could do for herself was to let it go. I sat in silence for a few moments, trying to absorb what Clara was telling me. I had always thought that, despite our problems, Helena still loved me enough to fight. But, apparently, her love had changed. It was no longer that passionate love that demands attention, fights, and reconciliations. It was a quiet love for herself. A kind of love that, apparently, didn't need me to continue existing. And that was something I wasn't ready to understand. As Clara spoke, I began to realize that, for a long time, I had been ignoring the signs. Helena had changed. She had gone through a silent healing process, something I hadn't noticed because I was too busy with my own plans. And now, she had reached a point where there was no going back. What was left for me was to accept this new reality, but honestly, I didn't know how. The conversation with Clara left me even more lost, because it made me realize that Helena was already at peace with the decision. And I was just beginning to understand what I had done. Now, it wasn't about trying to win her back. I needed to figure out how to live with the fact that she was okay without me. Meanwhile, things with Ana Paula weren't going as I expected. When I decided to leave Helena, I thought I was trading a monotonous marriage for a new life full of passion and excitement. Ana Paula was fun, young, and at first, it seemed like everything with her was different, exciting. But over time, I began to realize that that initial excitement wasn't enough to sustain a real relationship. Slowly, the little things I admired in her started to irritate me. Ana Paula wasn't who I thought she was. At first, I thought it was just a matter of adaptation, that we were just going through the adjustment phase. But as the days, weeks passed, I started to realize the problem was bigger. She didn't have the balance that Helena had. She didn't have that patience, that quiet strength. And suddenly, I found myself missing things in Helena that I had never valued before. What used to annoy me about her now seemed to be exactly what was missing in Ana Paula. I began to realize that Ana Paula wasn't ready to deal with reality. She liked the idea of being with me, but didn't seem to understand what that really meant. The shallow conversations, the trivial arguments, the constant drama. It all started to suffocate me. I realized that, with Helena, even in our worst moments, there was a depth that I simply couldn't find in Ana Paula. The initial spark of passion began to fade, and what was left wasn't anything like what I had imagined. And then came the disillusionment. I was beginning to realize that my decision to leave Helena for Ana Paula had been based on a fantasy. I thought I was chasing something better, but in reality, I was running after an illusion. Ana Paula wasn't the future I wanted, and the worst part was that I had already destroyed my past with Helena. Now, I was stuck in a reality of my own making, but one that didn't seem to be what I truly needed. This disillusionment with Ana Paula hit me hard. It was like I had climbed a mountain only to realize the peak wasn't as high as it seemed. And deep down, I started to wonder if it wasn't too late to try to fix things with Helena. Then I discovered something that completely knocked me off my feet. Ana Paula was cheating on me. And not just with anyone. She was involved with Marcelo, a much younger colleague of mine. When I found out, I felt a mix of rage and shame. How could this happen to me? I, who always thought I was in control of everything, who left a marriage believing I was making the best decision, was now the one being cheated on. Ana Paula, who was supposed to be the new life I had been searching for, was involved with someone else without even trying to hide it. The discovery hit like a bomb. I went through all the stages. First, I denied it. I thought it was a misunderstanding, something that could be resolved with a conversation. But the truth was different. When I confronted Ana Paula, she didn't even try to hide it. She admitted, without remorse, that there was something between her and Marcelo. And that's when I realized how deluded I had been. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, but the fact that I had destroyed my marriage, believing in something that didn't exist. Ana Paula didn't seem at all shaken. While I was still processing what had happened, she simply said that these things happen. That things between us weren't that serious anyway. And that's when I realized the extent of my mistake. I had abandoned everything for a superficial passion, something that, for her, never had the same value it did for me. That certainty I had at the beginning, that I was doing the right thing, now seemed like a huge mistake. And the worst part was that there was no going back in time. I felt betrayed, but at the same time, I couldn't avoid the feeling that all of this was a kind of poetic justice. I betrayed Helena, and now I was being betrayed in the same way. But the difference was that, unlike me, Helena had moved on with dignity. And I was lost, stuck in a situation I had created myself. And the hardest thing to accept was that Ana Paula didn't care. There was no love, no regret, nothing. It was just the end of another phase that, for her, didn't mean much. At that moment, I realized I had destroyed something valuable for an illusion. And while I was dealing with the consequences of my mistakes, Helena was out there, living her life in peace. And that, more than any betrayal, was what hurt me the most. Because I knew that while Ana Paula moved on with Marcelo, I was increasingly alone. I reached the point where there was nowhere else to run. After everything that had happened, after watching my life unravel in Ana Paula's hands, I realized that the only person who might understand me was Helena. I didn't know if she would listen, but I had to try. It was hard to swallow my pride and pick up the phone to call her. My heart was racing, and my mind was full of doubts. Would she answer me? And if she did, what could I possibly say to justify everything I'd done? When Helena answered, her voice was calm, as always. There was no anger, no resentment, just a peace that, in a way, comforted me, but also made me uncomfortable. I tried to explain, in a few words, what had happened. I talked about Ana Paula and Marcelo, about how lost I felt. I waited for Helena to show some emotion, maybe some sign that she still cared. But she just listened without interrupting, and when I finished speaking, her silence weighed even more. I knew there wasn't much left to say. The damage was already done, and I had no illusions that she would come back to me. But somehow, just talking to Helena gave me a sense that perhaps, deep down, she was still the only person in the world who could understand me. Even after everything, I clung to this fragile hope. And the truth is, I wanted more than just to be heard. I wanted somehow to fix things. I just didn't know how. But Helena, with all her calmness, made it clear that she had already moved on. Without being rude, without attacking me, she simply said that it didn't make sense to go back to what was. She had found a peace that I was still struggling to reach. Her words hit me hard. As much as I wanted it, I knew she was right. There was no going back. I had lost her, not because of Ana Paula, but because I had taken too long to realize what really mattered. The call ended peacefully, but painfully. I knew that from then on, Helena was no longer part of my life. And even though that was what I wanted when I asked for the divorce, now it seemed like the biggest mistake of my life. She was at peace, and I was just beginning to understand the price of my choices. After that first call with Helena, where everything seemed to have come to an end, I spent days mulling over her words. The silence after each sentence, the tranquility in her voice, all of it made me realize how far I had drifted from the one person who truly mattered. But there was something inside me that didn't want to give up. That's why, a few weeks later, I decided to try again. I picked up the phone, and with wavering courage, I called her once more. When the phone rang, my heart raced. With each second that passed without an answer, I felt a knot in my stomach, as if her not picking up was confirmation that everything was really over. But then she answered. Once again, the calm, serene voice, without any hint of rancor. "Hi, Rodrigo," she said. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts, trying to find the right words. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to say, but I knew I had to try one last time. I started talking about what had happened since we last spoke. I said that things with Ana Paula had really ended and that I had been reflecting a lot on everything that happened between us. I talked about how much I regretted it, how I now saw the value of what we had, something I never recognized while we were still together. I waited for her to respond, to show some sign of emotion, to indicate that there was still something there. Helena was silent for a moment, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her tone was the same as always, calm, but with a firmness that made it even clearer what was happening. "Rodrigo, I understand that you're going through a difficult time, but I've already made my decision. My life is on a different path now. Her words weren't said in anger, but with a certainty that completely disarmed me. She had no more doubts. And as much as I wanted a second chance, I knew there was no longer space for me on the path she had chosen. The call ended with a final take care from her, and I held the phone for a few minutes afterward, trying to accept what had been clear for a long time. She didn't hate me, but she didn't love me anymore either. What I was feeling now was just the reflection of my own choices. She had given me all the chances before, but I didn't realize their value. Now, all that was left was to face this reality alone. A few days after that call, I found out that Helena had decided to move to another city. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew she was moving on, but the idea of her going far away, without even looking back, made everything feel much more real. I knew that if I didn't try to talk to her in person, I would never have a chance to truly understand what was happening. So, I decided to look for her. I wanted one last conversation face to face, before she left for good. When I knocked on the door, I was greeted with the same tranquility that was already so familiar. Helena seemed surprised but not bothered by my visit. I felt nervous, like I was about to face judgment. She invited me in, and we sat in the living room, the environment so familiar, yet at the same time, so distant. I tried to start the conversation with something light, but soon gave up and got straight to the point. I asked how she was, how she felt about everything that had happened between us. She listened to me in silence, her eyes steady on mine, but without any resentment or bitterness. When she finished hearing me out, Helena began to speak with a clarity that surprised me. "Rodrigo, what we went through was hard, but it taught me a lot about myself. I don't hold any grudges, but I also know I can't go back. It took me a long time to understand that, and now, what I want most is to move forward without looking back." Her words were simple, but full of meaning. She had made peace with the past in a way I still couldn't. I tried one last time to explain my feelings, to tell her how much I regretted it, how much I wished I could fix my mistakes. But Helena just shook her head, with a sad smile. "I forgive you, Rodrigo, truly. But that doesn't mean we can go back to what we were. What I need now is peace, and I only found that when I left the past behind. It was at that moment that I realized there was nothing more I could do. She wasn't trapped in the memories anymore, while I, still stuck in my mistakes, couldn't move on. That conversation was the goodbye I never wanted, but perhaps needed. Helena was ready for a new chapter, and I had to accept that I wouldn't be part of it. As painful as it was, I knew it was the definitive end. She had made her choice, and as much as it hurt, I knew it was what was best for her. After that final conversation, I felt like everything had truly ended. But at the same time, something inside me still hoped for a turnaround, a moment of weakness from Helena that would make her reconsider her decision. However, she remained firm. I knew her family and friends, like her brother Gustavo, were also encouraging her to move on, to not be shaken by what had happened between us. They supported her unconditionally, and that bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. I imagined that maybe Helena might hesitate, that she would reconsider everything we had lived through. Even knowing that I had hurt her deeply, I wondered if there was a part of her that still held on to some feeling. The doubt gnawed at me, and in a way, I clung to the idea that, despite everything, there was still a chance to fix things. However, every time I thought about it, I remembered her words, the tranquility with which she told me she had decided to move on. And I knew, deep down, that this chance would never come. While I was still struggling with these thoughts, Helena was already resolute. She hadn't only forgiven me, she had also forgiven herself for all the times she might have allowed herself to be hurt. And that was something I didn't fully understand until now. She didn't want to go back. For her, moving forward was the only option, and nothing I said or did would change that. I found myself at a crossroads. Either I accepted this reality, or I remained trapped in a cycle of regret and pain. Her friends, especially Clara and Gustavo, were always by her side, reminding her of her strength, that she deserved a new life without the ghosts of the past. I knew they were right, and seeing that support made me realize that I was on the wrong side of the story. While they encouraged her to be strong and move forward, I found myself trying to drag her back to something that was already dead. And that made me feel even more distant from her, as if a chasm was opening between us. In the end, I realized that it wasn't just Helena's decision. It was a choice I also needed to make. I could keep trying to win back what was already lost, or accept that the best thing for both of us was to leave the past behind. As painful as it was, I knew that was the only sensible choice. Helena had made her decision, and now it was my turn to decide whether I would accept it and move on or continue being stuck in what could no longer change. It was only after a long time that I began to understand what Helena truly meant when she talked about forgiveness. She had forgiven me, yes, but her forgiveness wasn't an invitation for us to start over. It was a release, a way to leave the past where it belonged, without carrying grudges into the future. Helena found peace within herself, something I still hadn't managed. And that peace had nothing to do with me. It was something she had achieved on her own, far from me and the wounds I had caused. I began to realize that forgiveness wasn't something you asked for, but something you earned. It wasn't an easy path, and Helena knew that very well. She had gone through an entire process of healing, of acceptance, while I was still struggling with the weight of my own mistakes. She no longer needed me for anything. The peace she had found was the result of her own strength, of her decision to move forward. And I knew that, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't be part of this new chapter. What hurt me the most was that her forgiveness didn't come with any desire for reconciliation. She had forgiven me, yes, but she also decided that her life would be better without me. And that was the hardest part to accept. She had moved on, and as much as I wanted to be part of her life again, I knew that the place I once occupied no longer existed. Her forgiveness was both a relief and a final blow because it meant I had to move on too. While Helena found peace, I found myself alone, dealing with the ghosts of the past and slowly learning to forgive myself as well. It was a long process, full of ups and downs, but I knew it was necessary. Her forgiveness showed me that it was possible to move on without carrying the weight of resentment. And over time, I began to find my own form of peace, far from the chaos I had created myself. Helena had taught me, without saying a word, that true liberation came from forgiveness, but mostly from accepting that some things simply end. Now, with Helena living her life in peace and me trying to rebuild mine, I knew the chapter had closed once and for all. What was left for me was to learn from my mistakes, leave the past behind, and perhaps one day, find my own peace, just as she had found hers.